So welcome. I'm Jim Berg. I'm a member of the OCAMPR board. And today we have with us Stephen John Harris, who is a licensed psychologist in private practice at Newport Beach, California. He is going to be presenting this afternoon a paper on transforming to be or not to be, an exploration of the relationship between pain and suffering to compliance and resistance. Stephen.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I'm very humbled. There are so many amazing presentations at this conference, and so I feel very privileged and humbled to be able to participate with you in this discussion. I'd like to start off with a definition of psychopathology that I'm starting to try out here. That symptoms, mental disorders, psychopathology, and mental illness are the result of the inability to suffer. I'm leaving this very general. Some people, out and out refuse to suffer, or we have defense mechanisms well documented that try to prevent us from suffering. And sometimes there are just biological or other temperamental issues as well, but either way, an inability to suffer. In this presentation, I'm going to examine the willingness of both the psychotherapist and the patient to be open to the possibility of anxieties and suffering as they begin their work together. And so I'm seeing this in this presentation as the main ingredient for compliance with treatment. And so you see both therapist and client or patient need to be agreeable, and they share in this burden. There are some traditional explanations for unsuccessful treatment. It's often attributed to the resistance, usually on the side of the client or patient, non-compliance, a mismatch in the alliance, not a good fit. Unrealistic expectations is very well documented in terms of premature termination from therapy. Or we blame the patient, we blame their pathology. We throw out words like they're just borderline or something, and perhaps fail to understand what happened in the unsuccessful treatment. Now, just for a moment, to return to this definition of psychopathology, I'm going to borrow some pieces from a quote by St. Nikolai Velimirovich of Serbia. Blessed is the man who uses his suffering, he says, and adds that in his mercy, God looses suffering on men because of their sins. It's by his mercy, not his justice. In the place of death, God gives healing through suffering. And suffering is God's way of healing the soul of its sinful leprosy and its death. Okay. So let's go to back to the title. Hamlet's question, to be or not to be, is also asking, is it nobler in the mind to suffer? And so we know, if we've had our Shakespeare, that a lot has happened to Hamlet for him to despair. He's felt betrayed by his friends. His uncle has murdered his father, and spurned love. There's a lot of heartache. And so there's implied in his monologue a lot of struggling over whether to live or die. So with this idea of being willing to suffer, I'd like to move us into looking at a definition of treatment compliance. That when a professional or a clergy member agrees to work together with the patient, they agree to enter into a dynamic where a successful outcome is a function of both the helper's and the client's or patient's willingness, capacity to suffer. And in this agreement, what I'd like to bring up is a very interesting quote by the American psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden. And what I'd like to talk about is that as a new client comes in, there are many unknowns and many possibilities, potentials, and obstacles, and even dangers that might be encountered. And quite often, especially new therapists, are eager to have a good, positive beginning and hope to build their caseload. And even the seasoned professional needs to be able to have a clientele. But I'm going to read to you this quote from Ogden that talks about some of the dynamics. Excuse me, it's like my pages got out of order here when they... Okay. All right. The analytic process reflects the interplay of three subjectivities, that of the analyst, that of the analysand, and that of the analytic third. You know, you'll have to excuse me. I have put my things out of order. I'd like to say this is a first, or I never do this, but now I've done it. So let me find my place. All right. Here we go. I apologize. To a large extent, the danger posed in the first meeting arises from the prospect of a fresh encounter with one's own inner world and the internal world of another person. It is always dangerous business to stir up the depths of the unconscious mind. The anxiety is regularly misrecognized by the therapists early in practice. It is treated as if the fear were that the patient will leave treatment. In fact, the therapist is afraid that the patient will stay. Now, that may or may not be your original thought, but there are difficulties that we have to manage when someone does decide to stay. Now I'd like to move us to another perspective. The Jungian perspective offers an interesting perspective on the beginning of treatment. And in this perspective, the therapist at the conscious level is seen as the healer, and the patient, of course, is the person who's come for help or wants to get better or feel better, the so-called sick. However, at the unconscious level, what is being interacted with is the unconscious patient of the therapist and the unconscious healer in the patient. And so in this model, for treatment to be successful, both the therapist and the patient need a cure. And so what this implies is that the patient is going to have to teach the therapist a lot about their emotional life, their inner world, what their suffering's about, and all of our expertise and professionalism, which may prepare us for maybe the right questions or the right way to engage someone. We really don't have any idea what we're about to encounter. So that is what this is about. And so quite often, as I'm going to talk about, the client, especially the more problematic issues they have, the deeper, the more primitive the personality issues, the more they're able to find the sick parts of the therapist. And that can take on some disturbing qualities, but it's a very important process in the healing process for the therapist to be able to use this. From this view, the expertise of the patient is one of teaching the therapist And it requires the therapist to be a patient, in a sense, as Harold Searles would say, the patient wants to heal the analyst so the analyst can heal them. So this puts the therapist, if one is open to what kinds of experiences they might experience with the patient, in a very vulnerable place, or at least potentially. And I'd like to bring up Georgian in the last talk brought up Wilfred Bion's idea of approaching a session without memory or desire. That everything that's happened before the session and before this treatment, it might be useful to know the history, but if we're going to experience things afresh, the effort is to sort of start, in a very waiting and not blank slate, but open to what will happen next. In a remarkable statement regarding the limitations of the human analyst, the Greek physician, Guggenball Craig, a Swiss Jungian analyst, quotes this. The Greek physician is that only the divine healer. The Greek physician isn't the one who heals, but is the divine healer, and the human doctor relationship is the only one who can facilitate the process. They can't do the healing. All right. Further from the Jungian perspective is the idea of the alchemical bath. These images were taken from a series of medieval woodcuts called the Rosarium, and the idea here is one of the therapist and the therapist and the patient getting into the water and immersing themselves in each other's unconscious. Not a literal bath, but the idea that there are two substances brought together, the unconscious of the patient and the unconscious of the therapist, and together the mixture of the two will produce a third substance. And this is what I started to read earlier prematurely, what the analytical third is. That remarkably, that quite often when two people get together, sounding similar to where two or three are gathered together, there Christ is in the midst of them, is this idea that two people getting together creates this third awareness that you would not have anywhere else. And and so it's very similar to also Jung's idea. Carl Jung used to have a plaque in his office with an ancient Celtic saying that translated meant bidden or not bidden, God is present. Now, I am not saying that these psychoanalytic ideas of the analytic third or the Jungian alchemical bath creating a third substance is the same as Christ being present among the three, but they're very provoking thoughts for thinking about what is happening psychologically, emotionally in the unconscious, and when we open up the possibility of how God might be present, we have an interesting way to think about what is going on. So I prefer to keep those separate, but in dialogue when we think about that. Maybe just for the everyday psychoanalyst, we just acknowledge there's this extra dynamic going on, but we open up the possibility of also thinking of theologically and ontologically about Christ's presence in the midst of the work between two people. And what I think is important about this effect is by being affected by the patient and not having our pre-existing ideas having too many memories or desires about what should happen in the session as we become more open, a vessel for the patient's experience, and it creates the possibility for exploration of the realities, perceptions, and awareness that either the patient knows but doesn't know how to transmit, maybe has never had language for before, and also becomes able to, through having a witness to their process, be able to articulate. Further, in terms of being open to the patient, is the idea that the therapist is being constantly analyzed by the patient. They watch our every move. They watch and see, well, how do they react to me? And how did they respond to that? And quite often, if you've worked with many difficult patients, sometimes they say one thing, and you think, oh, see what they're wanting me to say? And that's not what they wanted you to say. And so our attunement and our trying to listen to the conflicting messages or clarify more information about it without jumping to conclusions can be very useful. This is from David Sedgwick's The Wounded Healer, Countered Transference from a Jungian Perspective. And along these lines about the patient analyzing therapist, I'd like to bring up further, I mentioned Harold Searles earlier, is the idea, Searles wrote a paper about the analyst as a patient unto the patient. The patient wants to analyze the patient. And this tends to be more the case with more primitive cases, but it can happen in everyday garden variety depressions and anxiety. So what I want to talk about this is that what Searles highlights is that the patient finds something in the therapist that they need from them, and yet the therapist hasn't maybe developed that quality enough for the therapeutic relationship. A very good example of this is the passive, understanding, very supportive therapist. And this patient needed maybe a very firm presence, maybe a paternal father, someone to guide them more. And they will, goad and find this part of the therapist. And the therapist will be challenged to grow in this area, or there'll be an impasse. And so I think this is a really important thing for us to think about, is not only listening to what the patient wants is in a response for us, but also what are they finding in us. And if you've had this kind of patient, they are disappointed. Maybe if in the example I just gave, we weren't as firm, we were too understanding, and they felt like, well, I already know that, or thanks for supporting me, but I needed, something. And the most difficult part is when they don't know how to articulate. Maybe they haven't gotten that kind of help before, and so sometimes it takes our noticing what they, when this process is happening. I think probably one of a very concrete example of this is the patient who's been sexually abused, and a part of their personality, I'd really like to not say it's their whole personality, behaves seductively, and outer appearance might be they're being seductive, they're acting like they want to enact a sexual relationship with the therapist, but they are very deeply hoping for the protection and the safety and the firmness that comes with, of course, obviously not enacting the sexual relationship, but opening the dialogue, and in terms of starting with protection and refusing to, but also trying to understand what need is being met in this, ill-fated attempt to enact this, to find out what's behind it, not just say no. Okay. Now, as we go down this road of challenges from patients who, seem to look for something that's different than how we would like to be as a therapist, maybe we want to be that understanding, supportive therapist, and we're being pushed another direction, the stance of being right or secure in our authority, being the expert, can feel called into question, and the patient, again, as we just talked about, will continue to want to help change us. And the therapist can try to mask this or resist this, but as I mentioned a moment ago, this can stop the treatment. Okay. Now, I'd like to venture further into this part of the work where, very similar to the last presentation with Georgian, is the possibility of not knowing what to do at all. And Avner Bergstein is writing here, you can see the reference here, it says the psychotic part of the personality. That's different than being a psychotic person. Humbling as it may sound, every person has a part of their personality that can feel disoriented and lose reality if we're overwhelmed enough. Maybe like one of those insurance commercials where, there's a earthquake and then the fire and everything. If enough happens, we break down. So Avner Bergstein reports, sooner or later we find ourselves at an impasse. The patient repeats their complaint or accounts over and over again. We've run out of interpretations which provide symbolic meaning to their associations, or else these interpretations don't seem to matter. The patient's symptoms persist. They may even become worse, and we're at a loss. We become persecuted, irritated, bored, helpless, numb, or sleepy. We often feel guilty, impotent, ashamed, professionally insecure. We seek supervision. The patient may become openly aggressive, even violent, threatens to break off the therapy. We might even think, even for the best, that they quit. And this is if all goes well. That last sentence needs some clarification because it doesn't sound like all is going well, does it? So Bergstein goes on to suggest that what might be happening, Wilfred Bion used to talk about attempts of the therapist to empathize or to help the patient feel things that they've been avoiding feeling, and the defenses that come to block that from happening, Bion calls an attack on linking. The person is trying to, is unable to link. They're defensively blocking the emotion that they can't tolerate. And so very often, this kind of interaction, accounted for here by Bergstein, is called an attack on linking. But in his paper, Bergstein invites us to consider that is the linking. The linking is, I can't communicate how hopeless and overwhelmed I feel, and so I go on the attack. And so they're communicating both the frustration, anger, and aggression about their inability to communicate something that's never been formulated before. This is another aspect about the therapeutic relationship that is difficult, and that's that there's the part that we want to talk about and the part we don't want to talk about. The interpersonal school of psychoanalysis, and I think the relational school as well, it's very different than the Freudian days, talk about this fact that in an ongoing dynamic, not just someone dissociates because, all of a sudden something traumatic came up, but the whole therapy session is full of an ongoing sequence of what we want to talk about and what we don't want to talk about. Not just patient, but therapist too. There's things that we'd like to steer around and not go there. And so, again, What's useful, though, is when this starts to irritate us and we start to notice it, because we're now in the territory of what Donnell Stern called unformulated experience. We're having an experience, we're both avoiding it, maybe we feel this irritation or this kind of resistance, and something is not formulated. In fact, Donnell Stern devoted a whole book to that subject, unformulated experience. Okay, to sum up these difficulties, these threats to our ego, which are uncomfortable. Remember, if all goes well, we're going to link those together. And let's link our faith together. Helplessness can be an asset, as we have been discussing, I think, in different ways all weekend, to our faith, that we really need Christ's presence. The therapy comes to an impasse. The patient becomes worse. We feel guilty. The treatment feels threatening. It seems like there's an attack on our attempts to link things. And something is not being communicated. I'd like to give an example with a dissociative identity disorder patient that I work with. If you've either worked with dissociative identity disorder or just people who dissociate somewhat frequently with trauma work, sometimes the dissociation is an understandable unconscious defense. Something intolerable is unfolding and they blank out, they go somewhere else, or with a dissociative identity, another dimension, ego state, seemingly almost like another personality, shows up. And so often this feels like, oh, there we are. We're not going to get anywhere with that. I guess, I tried, and everything stops. But in a place of kind of helplessness when this happened, I forgot what the context was with this patient, went silent, and then this little child's voice, just in this little kid's voice, literally said, something is missing. And I wish I had a better accounting of it, because sometimes these experiences are disorienting enough for me. But I do remember that we put it together that was missing is that we were talking about an aspect of this woman's trauma who had been a lot of domestic abuse, including domestic sexual abuse and just some horrible torture. And what had been missing is that standing up for herself, I think so often as the therapist is trying to, help and show interest in this traumatized state, it's still experienced as a reenactment, intruding into areas that, are too uncomfortable, they're overwhelming. But by forming a little dialogue with this little child voice, we began to bring up what's been missing for this woman, her having her own voice, her inability to even say no or resist at all. She just went blank and went elsewhere, and this alternate ego state unfolded. So I think I'm just wanting to use that as an illustration of, everything seemed to be cut off, but once in a while, if we're listening, we might be able to piece together what was missing. So back to our theme, being willingness and open to suffer. A team of Jungian analysts, by examining the associations of both the patient and the analyst, found out, in other words, they had them kind of privately make notes or report later about the sequence of the session, that there was an almost exact correspondence of associations to in-session themes, what they both perceived what was being talked about, the analyst's own history and problems, In other words, the analysts, what they related to in their history, how it related back to what the patient was talking about. Their raw, pure emotional reactions were almost corresponding perfectly, and even physical, bodily responses were the same. So, and as I noted here, it also included the analyst frequently being able to say what was on the patient's mind. Now, as positive as that is, the utilization of countertransference into the relationship, there's a caveat. We're not always willing to be open to those feelings. And David Sedgwick points out that even though it has great potential for therapeutic attunement, the analyst may also resist those feelings. And sometimes by thinking they know what is going on, by submitting themselves to the patient's either corrective action or whatever, the analyst actually can suffer kind of a defeat in order to be genuine. And this is once again that same humbling effect on our ego from an elevated state of, yes, I know what's going on, to the corrective result of interacting with the patient's experience or our inability to understand it. And finally, Albert Ellis, the famous cognitive, actually rational emotive therapy, said the most resistant client is the therapist. And so through this process of becoming aware of suffering and anxieties, both the patient and the therapist can become aware of their wounds. Both the client and the therapist may experience primitive emotional parts of themselves. Sometimes suffering is experienced by not knowing. I don't know about you, but it feels important when someone comes in, especially when they're newer, to feel like we're communicating, that we're getting what's going on with them, a sense of competence that we can help them. And that isn't always a ready process. Sometimes we have to go through not knowing in order to get somewhere. We lose our authority. Sometimes there's a role reversal where we're being taught, and the question can almost come to our minds, who's the expert here? So, in summary, the therapist may need to undergo healing for the therapy to prevail. The perspective on psychopathology and suffering, James Hillman said that pathologizing is a very important activity of the soul. So, psychologically, he breaks apart this word. Psyche is the soul, pathos he's using to communicate suffering. There's some other, and logos around meaning, not the theological Christ, logos, but to put together a definition that psychopathology means the meaning of the suffering of the soul. Now, from an orthodox view of suffering, to go back to this idea of our comfort and our preference to be an expert, or our preference to stay within our theoretical security, St. Basil the Great points out that health and prosperity are not good or helpful insofar as it does not render good to those who possess it. Health cannot be counted upon among those things that are good by nature. Further, Jean-Claude Larcher says, health can even be evil if it makes us indifferent to salvation, giving us the false impression that we're self-sufficient, that it gives us a sense of strength, and rather than giving us the weakness through which God reveals himself. A further perspective on suffering and its importance is that hope can be found in bearing the worst. in my work, I have found that patients who can communicate their suicidality, once they can get past past this, they're going to be thrown in the hospital and locked up or something, that my ability to tolerate that and be able to hold on to it with them actually begins a process of hope for many patients. Not all patients, but at one point, Donald Winnicott, the famous British psychoanalyst, once told his patient who was totally hopeless, "I am finally getting some hope in our work together by knowing how bad it is for you, to know how hopeless it is." And so there is this aspect sometimes of the patient who we have to hold the hope for them. And our knowing it together is something to build from. And my hope would be, another hope, is that we wouldn't steer away from the discomfort of suicidality, and that that becomes a part of knowing how bad it feels, from which hope can emerge. There are a lot of parallels in our faith when things are hopeless and despair, that when we feel helpless, that this is when God appears through His grace and His love. So, to return to this theme of the wounded healer, or physician, heal thyself, our work will make us vulnerable to pain. And it's important to understand that therapists sometimes avoid feelings of shame by being a helper, being a selfless helper. A lot of research has found that many therapists and clergy grow up in homes where their needs were not responded to as well, and they made themselves invulnerable to pain by becoming a selfless helper. It's almost as if, for many, the profession is a master defense against pain and vulnerability. And, this sometimes can be hard to acknowledge, but it can be very useful in our work to begin to engage and understand. So, very often, when our needs weren't responded to, those of you who fit in this category, we can avoid feeling selfish by just being selfless. And therapists can make their needs not count. And by just being in the listener role, the understanding helper, this can be another way to protect against being vulnerable. And as I'm going to guess a lot of you know, our intimate needs can't be met completely through another. It can feel rewarding to help, but this defense can only last so long. And so I probably should have put this last bullet point at the top of the list. I could have, but unable to heal parents, we can try to help and heal others. So the idea of self-care becomes really important. I'm going to switch over to some sage advice from Father Deacon Stephen Muse, but before I do, I want to stop and kind of go off script and talk about that for a minute. If you're not in consultation and supervision groups, whether you're clergy or therapist or physician, I recommend that. It's good to, in my professional world, we kind of have, I guess you could call it a brown bag kind of lunch, where we get together and talk about our cases. So we have lunch together and spend the middle of the day talking about our work. If you do really difficult work, make sure, in my opinion, to be in an ongoing therapeutic relationship, whether it be spiritual director, therapist, Holy Father, etc., but be engaged in these parts of yourself. Okay, sage advice from Father Deacon Stephen Muse. We cannot have mercy towards others without experiencing for ourselves, and we will not recognize the value of deep listening unless we have experienced being on both sides of the equation. often enough to know how much we ourselves are in need of mercy and have received mercy. This is why I believe the most important preparation for doing the work of pastoral counseling is being loved. If we're the omnipotent, all-understanding therapist, if we, fail to accept that we can't help everybody, if we hold our stance too tightly and aren't open to suffering, the self-sufficiency puts us in a position not to be able to be loved. And unfortunately, like the idea of the schizoid defense written about in the mid-20th century, burnout can result because we cut ourselves off from relationships, we cut ourselves off from feeling. It's hard to have an authentic religious practice, and it's hard to receive from our faith. This defense is so all-encompassing when we try to maintain too strong a position of professional authority and control and defensiveness. So we have to take our brokenness seriously and get help. So, if we decide we're going to engage our suffering, what is important about the suffering? It's transformative, can be religiously and psychologically meaningful. Georgian just talked really eloquently and deeply about our vulnerability and our helplessness leading up to the most profound parts of our faith. It opens us up for areas of healing that were previously shut down. I once had a patient who I was working with a lot of trauma in, and it brought me back into therapy. I became so, as I was attuned to her, I became so aware of so many old wounds that I didn't know I had, and so it was very meaningful for me, and it helped our work move along. And so it improves our capacity for growth. This is where I'd like to bring in, as we hopefully can be humbled and recognize our helplessness and our dependency on God. This quote from St. Nikolai Velimirovich: "Blessed is the man who uses his sufferings, knowing that all suffering in this brief life is loosed on men by God in his love for mankind for the benefit and assistance of men. In the place of death, God gives healing through suffering. Suffering is God's way of healing the soul, its sinful leprosy and death." You might recall I gave parts of that quote at the beginning. And Father John Bear's in-depth study of the early church fathers about the cross and becoming human, it was his account of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was being brought to Rome to be martyred, discouraged all of his supporters from trying to intervene. He said that his martyrdom had him feeling the birth pangs of life. It says, as through being able to die, it is that through this that we also become human. But how is this so? How can it be? We have to surrender old traumatically informed defenses, and our defenses will block our relationship with God and others. And our ability to die, I have in quotes here, and to suffer is the key. Fear is cast out by love, and death opens the door to relationship. So we're not talking about just physical death, although literal physical death is part of this process, but there are other deaths. There are loss of a loved one. There's going through an illness that changes life as we knew it. And there's loss of emotional control as we go through different changes or challenges in our life, in our family, our profession, and maybe even work with patients. Our defenses can be overwhelmed. Trauma itself is a loss of life as we knew it, and some wounds can change us forever, kind of thorn in the flesh. To be or not to be is transformed through allowing the suffering and being able to die to self. So the ultimate healing is the cross. Once again, the cross is the path to healing. It must be engaged in our dialogue with our human suffering to be a truly orthodox psychotherapy. Thank you. Yeah, we do have some time. How about that? Sorry, but we just need you to go to the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just kind of, okay.
Sorry.
It's just a,
For the recording, so they'll know what I'm talking about when I
Okay.
respond to you.
I just wanted to ask, when you said, meaning of the suffering of the soul equals psychopathology, unable to heal parents, try to heal or help others. You mean your own parents?
Right.
Is it-
Many therapists will grow up in an environment where they almost, very often, I can't speak for everybody, but many therapists adopt the role as either a parentified child, a child that's sort of recruited or given some kind of special importance. And some of that process gives them the tools to become a good listener and almost like a little therapist and get well developed with training and so forth later. But also, there, along the way, many unmet needs that can be one-sided through only taking care of others. And so, yes, often it emerges out of fractured relationships in childhood.
Okay.
Is that?
Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, sure. Okay.
How do you help clients, patients differentiate between the types of suffering that they shouldn't suffer for and the types that are worth suffering for?
I mean, that's a good question, and I want to assume I know what you mean, but can you give an example? You mean needless suffering versus...
Correct.
Yes.
And some of it could either be in depression or anxiety. I mean, it's the regret. Depression might be a classic example, a textbook example, whereas this is all in the past now.
Yes.
But how do we harness that in a positive way? But how do we communicate that to the client in a positive way?
Great question. This is, in my mind, one of the big paradoxes of psychotherapy. Very often, psychology can be, especially psychoanalysis, can be accused of being obsessed with the past. And one of the it's a paradox because the more one understands one's past, not just as an archaeological process of digging up old facts or ways that they feel spurned or in despair of things that have gone bad and they're kind of seems stuck or obsessed on that, is how they are still living out that past in the present. And so the discovery of how this is still taking place and making links to the past and helping them realize, like, wow, I'm still living this out. It's positive to learn about how your past affects you so that you can move on into the present and in the future. And so sometimes that still can encourage someone who is very self-pitying and very negative to almost double down on the negativity. And so that also becomes part of the therapeutic relationship in terms of how it's still playing out and how invested they are. And very often learning how, not only how the patient is doing this with you, the therapist or the clergy, but also very likely how it's still playing out in their relationships in their life and helping them look at and confronting how that's still being lived out.
And that suffering could be a form of comfort for them, and the doubling down is a resistance to that the discomfort of giving up that comfort. Now,
yes, right.
So those tools or techniques that might be used, and I say this as a total amateur, is something like acceptance and commitment therapy. Are there various approaches to employ?
My experience of acceptance and commitment therapy has been that it's the right therapy at the right time, but sometimes getting someone to that place where they would be able to engage that level of it they're not ready to. To use a further example, I have a patient I saw who was suicidal for 15, 20 years. You'd think, really? But through an ongoing process of doing something very similar to what you said, acknowledging how having, I forgot if it was the pills or some way of killing herself was a comfort to her to know it was there, but she wasn't really going to do it, but she had to have this escape route. And the more we talked about how hopeless it felt to her, the more it loosened. And so this is a very paradoxical thing, because some people are certainly very invested in things being bad, but in her case, the uncovering of how hopeless it really felt, and having a fellow human being know that and witness it about things that she had grown up with and never been able to tell anybody about and so on, was worth going past just the negativity and learning about why it was so hopeless. And the more that the more she has been able to have someone know that, the more it's loosened, and she's moving on now, So it's not just insight. Insight is really overrated, It's not like, the light came on and everything's great. So then this acceptance and commitment therapy, this is when they've kind of got to a point where they're ready to enact a plan and really, stick to it, and sometimes even fight off the negativity, much more ready to do it. So there's a bit of a phase thing here of readiness that is important.
One final question. When we talk about suffering, and you opened up with the concept of the healer is the one being healed as well, simultaneously, to what extent, when we talk about the concept of suffering, does co-suffering benefit the client?
So when you say co-suffering, do you also mean sort of sharing?
Empathetic listening, perhaps, something like something that would, when you talk about the client that was suicidal that had the pills,
right.
Relating to them in a way that gives them a level of comfort, besides the comfort of knowing that the pills are there.
Right.
And yet it's almost like it's an alternative. It's like my trigger for comfort is knowing the pills are here, but now the therapist can employ a different trigger.
Right.
And perhaps it's that journey of perhaps discovering the proper trigger.
Yeah. In this patient, we circled back to that several times, and there'd be a time where, this was that dissociative identity patient. It's like the old idea of multiple personality.
Sybil.
Yeah. And every time I could understand the hopelessness that was behind it, she'd pull it like a knife out of her purse and just surrender it. It was, for some people, that's like some kind of manipulation, like they're, I'm going to use this but it was just, I didn't even know what was going on. And it was just like, thank you, so difficult. It's so contextual, but empathy has been extremely important in cases like that, because it moves from everything's hopeless because nobody knows and I feel trapped, to someone knows and I'm starting to be able to feel this with someone and feel the relief of that, and the tears that flow through having that come out and being known and understood, as well as the meaning behind it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for the thoughtful way you've put all these concepts together in dialogue. I'm curious a little more about Beyond's attacks on linking, and then the idea of how that might translate into our faith, in the sense of, if I know part of one of your slides talked about defenses, is that blocking our relationship with God or with others, and kind of how to have those two things in dialogue, whether we're therapists or clergy or any of those things, and how you would sort of speak to that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I guess this is the place I'm going to do it, because Radha, the managing editor of St. Sebastian Press, she wanted me to bring up my book that just came out, and I told her, I'm going to blame you for. In this book I wrote, I talk about these very things. There's about, I categorize it into three main defenses. One is that we withdraw from needing others and the persecutory feelings that come with that. In psychoanalysis, we call it the paranoid schizoid position. And so it's kind of a self-sufficient withdrawal, as well as the false self that Winnicott talked about, which is to act like everything is fine and become agreeable and accommodate others. And of course, we know that patients do this all the time. And finally, omnipotent defenses. And by omnipotent, I mean just trying to control or be self-sufficient ourselves, instead of relying on God and others. And in this book, I address ways this does affect our faith.
What's the title of your book?
God, Psychology, and Faith in Dialogue. She said there's like one copy left, but she says if you'll order it today, it's $5 off and free shipping. There's your commercial.
God, Psychology, and Faith.
And Faith in Dialogue. So, yes, Georgian, and then.
Yes, first, thank you for this very rich and path opener talk.
Thank you.
I've had many thoughts, but I just want to say that you created a word for us, and that is the helpler. I was thinking your slip, where is that coming from? And I thought it's a condensation of the helpless helper.
Yes.
That we all
Right.
sometimes are. So thank you very much.
Yes, right. Thank you. The helpless helper.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
I work as a chaplain, and one of the things that would really make it difficult for me when I am dealing with people who have no faith at all, whenever they say, Father, when I die, there's nothing beyond it. When I die, that's it. Here, we are able to see that there's always hope, because when we surrender, then there is always our Lord, and He is there that could give us that hope, the possibility for healing even in the midst of pain and suffering and everything. I have seen all through that. But my difficulty is always when someone would say, there's nothing beyond there.
Mm-hmm.
Because when that happens, when we talked about end-of-life care, the most that I can do is always, okay, then go back to what to your family, to the memories, to the things that you're able to accomplish, the legacy that you're able to live.
Yes.
But it's never enough, because there are times you said, Father, it's just so dark. After all these things, it doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have experienced this, or if you have met clients like this, what do you do?
I don't have that experience. I have that experience of individuals who have had someone die. They're grieving, losing a parent, or even more painful, at least in my mind, is a parent losing their child to suicide or a premature death through illness. And my most recent perspective on this is to use a lot of the research that was reported yesterday. Is anyone else there? It was about, you were there, remember your name, from Fuller.
Yeah, Casey.
Casey, yes, about how part of the grief process. This is in not religious literature. It's for the Orthodox. It's a very old concept that we know that people live on in eternity. But there's all kinds of emerging psychological research that is showing that people do believe in all kinds of manifestations of how the dead one has lived on, and they look for it in all kinds of signs. Like they'll have an intuition that their favorite color was blue, and they start seeing blue everywhere, and or something that their parent did for them, like they had a certain way of making cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving, and so they took over this function. Or they talk to them. They talk to the dead. And these aren't necessarily, some of them are religious, but some of them have a way of forming a relationship with the dead after they die. Now, I think this is different than the case, that you're bringing up, that they're talking about their own death. But I think there's something interesting. I have a patient now who's agnostic, but she is so interested in this, like how do they relate to their, in her case, her son who committed suicide, having a relationship, or is there a relationship possible? And I think one way to do this would be to have them look at the social science about how humans are relating to death. And another example is Carl Jung once reported that he studied people who were about to die, and he studied their dreams, and their dreams had no anticipation of death at all. They kept dreaming about life moving on, even though they were terminal and close to dying. And he interpreted that as the psyche just lives on, the soul keeps going. So there's a lot to try to work with here, but I think sometimes, like in my case, I don't know if it relates to your case, I'm getting her to look at eternity and religion and maybe faith through the psychological literature about how people just instinctually think about their loved ones past physical death, how they live on in eternity. So it's time, isn't it?
Thanks, Stephen.